Welcome to my channel.
The rain in Lochdubh was not merely water falling from the sky. It was a malicious, semi-solid entity that sought out every gap in a window frame and every weakness in a waterproof jacket. It was a dry day, a day when the mountains of Sutherland shrouded themselves in grumpy grey mists and refused to come out, and the wind howled down the sea loch like a bagpiper with a grudge. Inside the Tommel Castle Hotel, however, it was warm. The fire crackled with satisfying ambition in the grate, and the air smelled of damp wool, floor wax, and coffee. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth was currently engaged in his favourite police activity, aggressively ignoring the concept of duty. He was slumped low in a worn leather armchair near the fire, his long legs stretched out nearly to the hearth. To the casual observer, and indeed to his superiors in Strathbane, Hamish appeared to be a man whose ambition had long since died of exposure on a Highland hillside. His flaming red hair was, as usual, resisting all attempts at order. His uniform looked as though it had been slept in, which was a distinct possibility. His small, scruffy dog, Lugs, was a curled, hairy mat at his feet, emitting occasional whimpers as he chased dream rabbits. Hamish held a mug of coffee in both hands, letting the heat seep into his long fingers. He should have been at the police station. The phone might be ringing. Chief Inspector Blair might be on the other end, purple-faced and demanding to know why Hamish hadn't arrested anyone for sheep worrying in the last 24 hours. But the phone wasn't ringing where Hamish was. It was ringing in an empty police station, and that was a very different philosophical concept. Hamish took a slow slurp of coffee. He was a man who worked very hard at appearing lazy, a survival tactic necessary to avoid the terrifying spectre of promotion. Competence was punished with a transfer to Glasgow visible sloth, was rewarded with being left alone in his beloved quiet Lochdubh. The peace of the hotel lobby, currently shared only with Mr. Patel, the long-suffering manager who was polishing brass behind the reception desk, was shattered by the banging open of the main doors. A gust of wet wind blew in, accompanied by a man who looked as if he had stepped straight out of a glossy London magazine, one of the ones that cost £5 and contained mostly advertisements for watches nobody needed. He was tall, impossibly tanned for October in Scotland, and possessed teeth so white they seemed to generate their own light source. He wore a quilted jacket in a shade of electric blue that startled the subdued Highland decor, designer jeans that were far too tight for practical country living, and pristine white trainers that were already regretting their life choices against the muddy car park outside. He shook himself like a wet retriever, spraying water over an antique side table, and marched to the desk, ignoring Hamish entirely. Hamish sank 3 inches lower in his chair, a Sassenach. And not just any Sassenach, but the loud, moneyed variety. "You there?" the man boomed at Mr. Patel, his voice a rich, fruity baritone that echoed unpleasantly in the small space. "Check in. The name is Croft. Julian Croft." Mr. Patel, whose dignity was impregnable, slowly put down his polishing cloth. "Welcome to the Tommel Castle Hotel, Mr. Croft. We were expecting you." "I should hope so. The drive up here is abominable. Are these roads even legal? My Aston Martin nearly bottomed out 3 times, and the network coverage is non-existent. How is one supposed to run an empire without signal?" Hamish peered over the rim of his mug. He knew Julian Croft, though he had never met him. Everyone in Lochdubh knew of him. Croft was the self-styled wellness evangelist, a man who had made millions selling expensive green powders and the concept of mindfulness to stressed-out city bankers. He had recently purchased the old MacGregor estate just outside the village, a sprawling, drafty pile of stone that he intended to turn into an exclusive holistic retreat. The village was already seething. Mrs. Wellington at the post office was outraged because Croft received packages too heavy for her to lift. The minister, Mr. Wellington, no relation, just a confusing geographical coincidence, was suspicious of holistic practices, sensing paganism, and the local farmers hated him because he had complained about the smell of cow dung in the country. "Your key, Mr. Croft," Mr. Patel said soothingly, sliding a heavy brass key across the counter. "Dinner is served from 7 until 9. Croft wrinkled his perfect nose. "Dinner? I hope you accommodate dietary requirements. My body is a temple. No gluten, no dairy, no nightshades, no red meat, and absolutely nothing processed. And I'll need an oat milk matcha latte delivered to my room in 20 minutes. Ensure the water is exactly 80 degrees. Mr. Patel blinked once, slowly. "I will inform the kitchen, sir. We have semi-skimmed milk from Archie's cows down the road." "Good God," Croft muttered, snatching the key. Barbaric. He turned on his expensive heel and strode toward the stairs, nearly tripping over Lugs, who had woken up and stretched a paw out. "Watch it, you mangy cur!" Croft snapped, kicking out instinctively. She missed the dog, but caught the leg of Hamish's chair. Lugs yelped, more in surprise than pain. Hamish did not move, but his sleepy hazel eyes suddenly sharpened, losing their carefully cultivated bovine expression. They became the eyes of a very intelligent man watching a very stupid fly land on a very sticky web. "That is a police dog you are kicking, sir," Hamish said mildly, his Highland lilt soft and deceptive. Croft stopped and stared down at Hamish, as if noticing a piece of chewing gum stuck to his shoe. "Police dog? That mop? And you are, what? The local constable?" He laughed. A sharp, dismissive sound. "Scruffy little village, scruffy little policeman. Don't expect me to donate to the policeman's ball." "We don't have a ball," Hamish said, taking another sip of coffee. "We have a ceilidh, and it's BYOB. Croft sneered. "Charming. Try to stay out of my way, officer. I have important clients arriving tomorrow, and I don't want the view spoiled by peasantry." He swept upstairs, leaving a scent of expensive cologne and aggressive entitlement in his wake. Hamish watched him go, then slowly lowered his mug to the floor for Lugs to lick the dregs. He sighed. The rain beat harder against the glass. The quiet day was ruined. Julian Croft was the sort of man who attracted trouble like a sheep attracted ticks, and Hamish had a sinking feeling that his attempt to avoid work had just been spectacularly unsuccessful. He was going to have to keep an eye on that one, and that sounded suspiciously like effort. The following morning did nothing to improve the weather or Hamish's disposition. He sat at the small, scarred wooden table in his police station kitchen, nursing a bowl of porridge that was mostly salt and determination. Trugg sat opposite him, watching every spoonful with the intense, vibrating focus of a professional beggar. The wind rattled the window pane, threatening to blow the glass straight into the sink, and Hamish found himself wishing he had never seen Julian Croft or his neon blue jacket. Men like Croft didn't just bring bad fashion to the Highlands, they brought a frantic, demanding energy that usually resulted in someone, usually Hamish, having to do something official. The telephone in the front office let out a shrill, piercing ring. Hamish froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth. He considered, briefly, and with great sincerity, letting it ring until the caller gave up and moved to Australia. But the ringing persisted with a rhythmic, hysterical quality that suggested the caller wasn't merely looking for the time of the next bus to Inverness. Well, Hamish sighed, dropping the spoon. "Duty calls, Lugs. Though I suspect it's just Mrs. Gowan complaining about the Curry's cat again." It wasn't Mrs. Gowan, it was a panicked, breathless Mr. Patel from the hotel. "Macbeth, you must come to the MacGregor estate, quickly. It is that Mr. Croft. The milkman, Archie. He was dropping off the semi-skimmed against the gentleman's wishes, mind you, and he saw through the glass of that newfangled extension." "Is he having a tantrum about the milk, then?" Hamish asked, hopefully. "He's dead, Hamish. He's in a giant egg." Hamish blinked. "An egg?" "One of those sensory deprivation pods he had shipped up from London. Archie says he looks like a poached salmon, but, well, shorter, and very blue." Hamish let out a long, weary breath. He reached for his peaked cap, which was currently serving as a coaster for a dusty bottle of whiskey, and whistled for Lugs. A giant egg. QTT couldn't just be a heart attack in a comfortable bed, could it? No, he had to go and be modern about it. The drive out to the MacGregor estate took 10 minutes of navigating flooded potholes and dodging suicidal sheep. The estate, once a proud, crumbling fortress of grey stone, now looked like a historical monument that had been attacked by a futuristic spaceship. Croft had bolted on a sleek glass and chrome wing that jutted out over the heather like a defiant chin. Archie the milkman was standing by his van, looking significantly paler than his cargo. He pointed a shaking finger toward the glass extension. Hamish climbed out of the Land Rover, his boots squelching in the mud, and walked toward the structure. Lugs followed, sniffing the air with sudden professional interest. Inside the glass room, surrounded by high-tech yoga mats and Himalayan salt lamps that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, sat the pod. It was a large, white, aerodynamic capsule, currently hissed open like a giant clam. Inside, floating in a shallow pool of Epsom salt-saturated water, was Julian Croft. He was no longer tan. He was a mottled, waxy shade of lilac. He was wearing nothing but a pair of designer silk boxer shorts and a very expensive-looking waterproof fitness tracker that was still dutifully flashing a green light, heartlessly recording a pulse rate of 0. His eyes were wide open, staring up at the ceiling of his expensive egg with an expression of profound, offended surprise. Hamish stood over the pod, his hands deep in his pockets. He didn't touch anything he didn't need to. He noticed the faint, bitter smell of something sharp beneath the scent of the expensive forest-scented candles that had burned down to stumps on the nearby table. She noticed the way Croft's tongue seemed slightly too large for his mouth, and the peculiar way one of his hands was clamped shut, as if he were holding onto a final, angry secret. What a waste of good water, Hamish murmured. Is he gone, Hamish? Archie called from the doorway, refusing to step onto the pristine white flooring. Aye, Archie, he's very gone. And he's gone in a way that's going to make my life very difficult. Hamish looked around the room. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood. It looked like a peaceful, holistic accident. But Hamish knew Lochdubh, and he knew that men who kicked dogs and insulted the locals rarely died of natural causes 24 hours after arriving. He looked at a small, discarded glass vial on the floor, tucked just under the edge of the pod's base. It was labeled Pure Zen Nighttime Elixir. He sighed, the sound heavy with the knowledge that his quiet week was officially buried. Already, in the distance, he could hear the faint, aggressive wail of a siren. It would be the boys from Strathbane. It would be DCI Blair, smelling blood and looking for someone to blame. Hamish adjusted his cap, looking every bit the slow, dim-witted village constable, while his mind began to sift through the list of every person Croft had insulted since crossing the border. It was a very long list. Right then, Hamish whispered to Lugs. Let's look stupid, shall we? It's the only way we'll get any real work done. The wail of the sirens reached a crescendo, a screech of tires on the gravel signaling the arrival of the Strathbane CID before the cars even came into view. 2 white police cruisers and a dark, unmarked sedan skidded to a halt near the glass extension, spraying Archie's milk float with a fresh layer of Highland grit. Detective Chief Inspector Blair erupted from the sedan like a cork from a shaken bottle of cheap cider. His face was already a worrying shade of magenta, his neck straining against a collar that had clearly lost the war with his appetite years ago. Behind him trailed Detectives Anderson and McNabb, both looking as though they would rather be anywhere else, preferably somewhere with a pub and no Blair. Macbeth! Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the glass walls and making the salt lamps vibrate. He marched into the Zen room, his heavy boots clattering with intentional disrespect for the pristine floor. I might have known I'd find you loitering at the scene of a tragedy. What have you done? Tripped over your own feet and knocked this poor man into his oversized breakfast. He was like this when I arrived, sir, Hamish said, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic Highland drawl that usually made Blair's blood pressure spike. He stood with his thumbs hooked into his belt, looking as vacant as a Highland cow in a summer meadow. Archie the milkman found him. I have touched nothing. Blair ignored him, peering into the pod with a mixture of disgust and dark satisfaction. Good God, what sort of degenerate dies in a plastic egg? Looks like a suicide. Look at that vial on the floor, Anderson. Pure Zen, probably full of some hippie nonsense he couldn't handle. Case closed before lunch. It might not be suicide, sir, Hamish ventured mildly, pointing a long finger toward the small glass vial. There's a smell, you see. A bit like bitter almonds, but masked by that forest scent he was so fond of. And his hand. Sirits clamped shut quite tight. Blair whirled around, his eyes bulging. I don't pay you to have a nose, Macbeth. In fact, I don't pay you to do anything other than stay in this godforsaken village and keep the sheep from voting. Bitter almonds. You've been reading too many of those tuppenny thrillers. It's a clear-cut case of an overdose. The man was a wellness nut. They're always the first to crack. He turned his predatory gaze toward the doorway, where Archie was still trembling by the milk float. You, the milkman. Come here! Archie shuffled forward, clutching his cap to his chest. I just brought the semi-skimmed, sir. He didn't want it, but the hotel said, save it for the station, Blair barked. Finding a body and not reporting it to a real policeman immediately. Very suspicious. Maybe you had a grudge, eh? Didn't like him complaining about your cows. McNabb, take this peasant to the car. We'll see how his story holds up under a proper light. But sir, Hamish said, his expression one of polite confusion. Archie wouldn't hurt a fly. He's been delivering milk to this estate since before Mr. Croft was born. That's exactly what a local would say to protect one of his own. Blair sneered, leaning in so close that Hamish could smell the stale cigarettes and peppermint on his breath. Listen to me, Macbeth. You stay out of this. You're sidelined. If I catch you investigating, I'll have you directing traffic in the middle of a Glasgow roundabout before the week is out. Do you understand? Hamish nodded slowly, the picture of a man thoroughly cowed. I understand perfectly, sir. I'll just take Lugs for a walk then. No sense in me getting in the way of such high-powered detective work. Blair grunted, already turning back to the pod to bark orders at the forensics team that was just beginning to unload their gear. He didn't see the way Hamish's eyes flickered toward the bedside table, noting a small rectangular indentation in the dust where a mobile phone should have been. Nor did he notice Hamish's foot move a fraction of an inch, subtly shielding a small, torn piece of blue paper that had blown under a chair, a piece of paper that looked suspiciously like a prescription fragment. Hamish whistled softly for lugs and beat a quiet retreat. He had been dismissed, which was exactly what he wanted. Blair would spend the next 6 hours bullying Archie and filling out the wrong forms, which gave Hamish just enough time to do what he did best: wander, listen, and mooch. As he climbed back into the Land Rover, the lazy expression remained on his face, but his mind was already at the village pub, wondering who Julian Croft had managed to truly enrage in his very short stay in Lochdubh. The game was afoot, even if the DCI thought the board was already folded. The Land Rover rattled as it descended the winding track away from the MacGregor estate, the suspension groaning in sympathy with Hamish's own weary bones. Through the rearview mirror, he watched the blue and red lights of the police cruisers flickering against the grey stone of the manor, looking like garish ornaments on a tomb. Blair would be in his element now, barking into his radio and imagining the medals he'd pinned to his own chest once he'd bullied a confession out of poor Archie the milkman. Hamish shifted ears with a wince. He didn't have a murderous bone in his body, unless one counted his habit of leaving the cream-top bottles in the direct sun during the height of July, which was a culinary crime but hardly a hanging offence. Luggs sat in the passenger seat, his wet fur emitting a pungent, earthy aroma that filled the cabin. "It's a bad business, Luggs," Hamish murmured, his eyes scanning the rain-slicked road. "A man dies in an egg, and the only person looking for the truth is a man who would rather be eating a hot pie." Lochdubh appeared through the mist, a cluster of whitewashed cottages clinging to the edge of the sea loch like stubborn barnacles. To any outsider, it was a picture postcard village of Gaelic charm, but Hamish knew every crack in the pavement and every secret behind the lace curtains. He parked the Land Rover outside the post office, a modest building that served as the nervous system of the community. Mrs. Wellington was behind the counter, her spectacles perched on the tip of a nose that had spent 40 years sniffing out scandal. She was currently sorting a stack of circulars with the precision of a card sharp. "He's dead, then? That English fellow?" she asked before Hamish had even closed the door. The village grapevine had clearly outpaced the police sirens. "Word travels fast, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, leaning his elbows on the counter and adopting his most helpless, aimless expression. "A terrible tragedy. DCY Blair thinks it's an accident, or perhaps the poor man just couldn't handle the Highland air." Mrs. Wellington snorted, a sound like a starting pistol. "Highland air?" It was more likely the contents of those boxes he was always receiving, heavy as lead and smelling of chemicals. He had no respect for the post, Hamish complained if his bioactive enzymes were 5 minutes late. And the letters, he was getting mail that didn't look like business, if you take my meaning. Hamish tilted his head. "What sort of mail?" "Handwritten, local. One came yesterday, no stamp, just pushed through the slot. The ink was smudged by the rain, but it was a woman's hand. Very elegant, very old-fashioned. Not the sort of thing a man like that usually inspires. Did you happen to see who dropped it off?" "I have a business to run, Macbeth. I cannot spend all day staring at the letterbox," she snapped, though they both knew she did exactly that. "But I did notice that young woman who works for him, the assistant, Miss Miller. She looked like she had been crying when she picked up his parcels on Tuesday. A nervous thing, all twitchy and smelling of lavender. She's staying at the hotel." Hamish thanked her and moved on, his mind clicking over the image of a crying assistant. He stepped back out into the rain and walked the short distance to the Tommel Castle Hotel. The lobby was quiet now, the storm outside making the interior feel like a sanctuary. Mr. Patel was still behind the desk, looking shaken. "I sent Archie home, Hamish," Mr. Patel whispered. The poor man was vibrating like a tuning fork. "That Inspector Blair, he is not a gentleman. He has the bedside manner of a grizzly bear with a toothache," Hamish agreed. "Tell me, Mr. Patel, did Mr. Croft have many visitors since he arrived? Aside from the milkman he was so keen to offend." Mr. Patel leaned in close. "Only the woman, Miss Miller. She is his wellness coordinator. But there was a phone call last night. I shouldn't have listened, of course, but he was shouting so loud the goldfish were hiding under their plastic castle. She was arguing with someone about a formula. He said he would ruin them if they didn't deliver the final batch. He sounded desperate, Hamish, not like a man who was at peace." Hamish nodded, his gaze wandering to the hotel's small lounge where a fire was still burning. "And where is Miss Miller now?" "In the breakfast room. She hasn't touched her tea. She looks as though she's waiting for the world to end." Hamish thanked him and moved toward the back of the hotel. He found Miss Miller sitting by a window, staring out at the grey expanse of the loch. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, with pale skin and hair the colour of weak tea. She looked fragile, like a piece of glass that had already been cracked and was waiting for the final blow. "Miss Miller?" Hamish said softly. "I am Constable Macbeth. I'm very sorry for your loss." She didn't look up at first. "He wasn't a kind man, Constable. You don't have to pretend. Julian was a predator. He sold dreams to people who were too tired to wake up." Hamish sat down opposite her. Ignoring the puddle his coat was forming on the carpet. If he was a predator, he must have had enemies. People had stepped on to get to the top of his wellness mountain. Miss Miller finally looked at him, and Hamish saw the sheer terror in her eyes. He was being blackmailed. He thought he could outrun it by coming here, to the middle of nowhere, but someone followed him, or someone was already here, waiting. Blackmailed over what? "The pure Zen elixir," she whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't herbal. It was addictive. He was spiking it with synthetic sedatives to make sure his clients kept coming back for more peace. Someone found out, someone who knew exactly what was in those vials. Hamish felt a cold prickle at the back of his neck. The bitter almonds. Cyanide was a classic poison, but in the world of high-stakes wellness, it was also a very loud statement. "Did he have his phone with him last night?" Hamish asked. "He never went anywhere without it. It was his life." "Why?" "Because it wasn't in the pod," Hamish said. "And neither was the person who took it." He stood up, his mind racing. The Sassenach had brought his dark secrets to Lochdubh, but the killer had been intimate enough to know his routine, his egg, and his vices. He needed to find that phone, and he needed to find out who had sent that handwritten letter. "You stay here, Miss Miller," Hamish said, his voice firm. "Lock your door. DCI Blair will be looking for a scapegoat, and you're a very easy target." He walked out of the hotel, the mooching phase of his investigation having yielded a harvest far more bitter than he had expected. The village was no longer just a backdrop for his laziness, it was a map of motives. He looked up at the darkening sky. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and somewhere in the shadows of the mountains, a killer was likely watching the lights of the police cars fade, thinking they had committed the perfect, natural crime. Hamish climbed back into his Land Rover, his face a mask of rural simplicity, while inside, the gears of a much sharper machine were turning with lethal precision. He had one more stop to make before the night truly set in. The manse. If anyone knew about elegant, old-fashioned handwriting and the darker side of the village's soul, it was the minister's wife. He just hoped she had some of her famous ginger cake left. It was going to be a long, very dangerous night. The Land Rover's wipers were putting up a heroic, if ultimately futile, struggle against the torrential downpour as Hamish steered the vehicle toward the outskirts of the village. The gravel crunching under his tires sounded like bone being ground to powder, a morbid thought that he couldn't quite shake. He was heading for the manse, but a flash of silver near the old stone bridge forced him to stomp on the brakes. There, standing beside a sleek Volvo that looked entirely too refined for the mud-caked Highland roads, was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was dressed in an impeccably tailored Barber jacket and green Wellington boots that probably cost more than Hamish's monthly salary. Her blonde hair was tucked neatly under a waterproof hat, and even in the midst of a gale, she managed to look like she was posing for a country life magazine. Hamish felt that familiar, irritating flutter in his chest, a mixture of deep affection and the crushing realization that they lived in two entirely different worlds. He rolled down the window, letting in a spray of icy water that soaked his shoulder. "Priscilla, you're back," he called out, his Highland lilt softening despite himself. "I didn't think the Colonel expected you until the shooting season was well underway." Priscilla turned, a small, weary smile touching her lips. "Hello, Hamish. I came up early to help Father with the estate accounts. And I heard the news. It's all over the glen already. The Wellness King has abdicated his throne in a rather permanent fashion, hasn't he?" Hamish climbed out of the Land Rover, lugs following suit with a disgruntled yelp as his paws hit the cold mud. "Aye, Julian Croft. He's gone and found a very modern way to die in a very old-fashioned village. DCI Blair is currently trying to pin it on Archie the milkman, mostly because Archie was the first person he could find to shout at." Priscilla sighed, leaning against her car as the rain drummed against the roof. "Archie? That's ridiculous. Even Blair must see that." But Julian Croft was, well, he was a particular type of person, Hamish. He stayed at the castle for a few nights when he first arrived, before the renovations on the MacGregor place were finished. He tried very hard to be part of the set, if you know what I mean. He was desperate for father's approval, and for an invitation to the hunt. He thought money could buy him a seat at every table in Sutherland. And did it? Hamish asked, stepping closer to share the meagre shelter of her umbrella. Hardly. He was a bore. He spent most of his time trying to find leverage on people. He seemed to think that everyone in the Highlands was hiding a dark secret that he could use to his advantage. He even made a few pointed remarks to father about the estate's boundary disputes from 30 years ago. He was a collector of grievances. Hamish. He didn't just want to be successful, he wanted to be feared. Hamish thought of the pure Zen elixir and the synthetic sedatives Miss Miller had mentioned. It seems he was doing more than just collecting grievances. He was selling a bit of addiction disguised as enlightenment. But I'm interested in a letter, Priscilla. Mrs. Wellington says a handwritten note was delivered to him yesterday. Local hand, elegant and old-fashioned. Not the sort of thing a man like Croft usually receives unless it's a bill. Priscilla's expression shifted, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. Elegant and old-fashioned. That sounds like Lady Jane from over at Ardnish. She's been in estate ever since Croft bought the MacGregor estate. Apparently, he had some old letters of hers written to a young officer during the war. They were found in a desk in the attic of the manor. He told her he was going to publish them in his memoirs to add a touch of local colour. It was blackmail. Hamish, plain and simple. She was terrified of the scandal. Hamish rubbed his chin, his mind working through the social hierarchy of the village. Lady Jane was 80, if she was a day, a pillar of the community, who still believed the Victorian era hadn't quite ended. Blackmailing an old lady over 60-year-old love letters. He really was a piece of work. He was, Priscilla agreed, her voice dropping. But there's more. Elspeth Grant was asking about him too. She's back in the village for a few days, working on a story for the paper about Highland land grabs. She was at the hotel last night, and she looked quite determined, Hamish. You know how she gets when she smells a story. Hamish felt a twinge of guilt. Elspeth was the other complication in his life, ambitious, and far more likely to get herself into trouble than the poised Priscilla. The idea of both women being in Lochdubh at the same time, both circling the same murder investigation, made him want to crawl back into his armchair and hibernate. Elspeth is here? He asked, trying to sound casual. She is, and I think she's already found something you haven't. She was talking to the chemist in Strathbane this morning. Something about a bulk order of almond oil that wasn't for cooking. Hamish nodded slowly. Almond oil. It could be used for massage, or it could be used to mask the scent of cyanide. I see. Well, I suppose I should go and find her before she writes an article that gets us both sacked. Priscilla reached out and touched his arm, her fingers light but lingering. Be careful, Hamish. Blair is looking for a quick arrest, and if you're seen talking to outsider journalists and local gentry, he'll think you're conspiring. And Hamish, father is very upset about those letters. If you find them, perhaps they could just disappear before the forensics team gets their hands on everything. Hamish looked into her cool blue eyes. It was a request for a favour, the kind of subtle corruption that oiled the wheels of the upper class. He liked Priscilla, perhaps more than was good for him, but he was still a policeman, even if he did his best to hide it. I'll see what I can do, Priscilla, he said, non-committally. But right now, I have to go to the manse. I have a feeling the minister's wife has more to tell me than just the recipe for her ginger cake. He climbed back into the Land Rover, his heart heavy. The case was no longer a simple matter of a dead Sassenach in an egg. It was a tangle of old secrets, new addictions, and the competing interests of the two women who made his life a perpetual state of confusion. As he drove away, watching Priscilla's silver car vanish in the mist, he realized that the lazy part of the day was long gone. The darkness under the Highland charm was beginning to seep out, and it was colder than the rain. He needed a plan, and more importantly, he needed to find that missing phone before Blair's team realized it was gone. The game in Lochdubh was changing, and for the first time in a long time, Hamish Macbeth felt as though he was a few steps behind. He pressed his foot on the accelerator, the engine roaring a protest against the steep climb toward the manse, while Lugs whimpered in his sleep, dreaming of a peace that was fast becoming a memory. The manse stood like a sentinel of grim morality on the windswept rise overlooking the village, its dark stone walls seemingly soaked in centuries of Presbyterian disapproval. To Hamish Macbeth, as he pulled the rattling Land Rover into the gravel driveway, the house always looked as though it were holding its breath, waiting for someone to commit a sin. He climbed out, Lugs following with a reluctant trudge, and made his way to the back door. He knew better than to use the front. The front was for visiting dignitaries and the bereaved, and Hamish currently felt like neither, though his stomach was certainly mourning the absence of a proper lunch. Mrs. Wellington, the minister's wife, a woman whose energy levels were as terrifying as her husband's sermons, were long opened the door before he could even knock. She was wearing an apron that looked as though it could stop a bayonet charge, and held a wooden spoon like a scepter of office. "I wondered when you'd show your face, Hamish Macbeth," she said, though she stepped aside to let him into the warm, yeast-scented kitchen. "The whole village is talking about that poor man in the plastic egg. A judgment," the minister says. "A judgment on those who seek peace in gadgets rather than the good book. Sit down. You look like you've been dragged through a gorse bush backwards." She didn't wait for an answer before placing a thick slab of ginger cake and a steaming mug of tea in front of him. Hamish, true to his nature, did not protest. She took a large bite, the spicy warmth of the cake doing more for his investigative spirit than any police manual ever could. He leaned back, adopting his most vacant tea-drinking expression, while lugs settled under the table, hoping for a crumb of divine providence. "It's a strange business, Mrs. Wellington," Hamish said, his voice slow and inviting. The Sassenach was not well liked, it seems. Even the birds in the trees seemed to have a grievance against him. Priscilla tells me he was upsetting the gentry, and Miss Miller says he was selling more than just Zen in those little glass bottles. I hear there was a letter too, handwritten. Mrs. Wellington's eyes sharpened behind her spectacles. She took the seat opposite him, her hands folded over her apron. "Oh, there were letters, Hamish, but not just from Lady Jane. I saw Mr. Macbeth, the chemist, leaving the estate 3 nights ago. He was in a state, Hamish, red as a beetroot, and waving his arms about. You know Macbeth usually as quiet as a church mouse with a sore throat. But he was shouting about regulations and poisoning the well. He's been the chemist here for 30 years, and he takes his potions very seriously." Hamish nodded, memorizing the detail. Mr. Macbeth was a fastidious man, a bachelor who lived above his shop and kept his labels perfectly aligned. If Croft had been bypassing him to sell synthetic sedatives, MC Ivor would have been more than just professionally offended, he would have been morally outraged. Just as Hamish was about to ask more, the peace of the kitchen was shattered by the shrill ring of the telephone in the hallway. Mrs. Wellington hurried to answer it, her voice dropping into a hushed, respectful tone before she returned, her face pale. "That was Mrs. Curry from the shop. She says the police have descended on the pharmacy. That man Blair, he's arresting Mr. Macbeth, Hamish, right in front of the whole village. They say they found the poison." Hamish didn't finish his cake. He stood up, his lazy demeanor evaporating like mist in a gale. "I'd best go and see Mrs. Wellington. Thank you for the tea." He hurried back to the Land Rover, his mind racing. If Blair had found a suspect, he would be like a dog with a boner, very loud, very stupid dog. When he arrived at the village cross, a crowd had already gathered outside the pharmacy. Blair was there, his face a triumphant purple, as 2 officers led a bewildered, trembling Mr. Macbeth toward a waiting car. MC Ivor's white coat was slightly rumpled, and he looked small and frail against the rain-slicked pavement. "I told you, Macbeth," Blair roared as he saw the Land Rover approach. "Open and shut, we found a missing bottle of prussic acid in his locked cabinet, and his fingerprints are all over the vial we found at the scene." The old fool was jealous of the competition. A classic case of professional rivalry turned deadly. Hamish walked over to the pharmacy door, ignoring Blair's boasting. He looked at the window display, which was filled with old-fashioned remedies and sun-bleached boxes of bandages. Then he looked at Mr. Macbeth, who was being pushed into the back of the cruiser. The chemist was squinting through his thick glasses, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his spectacles on his nose. "It's a grand bit of work, sir," Hamish said to Blair, his voice thick with a fake admiration that would have made a more intelligent man suspicious. "But I was wondering, did you notice Mr. Macbeth's hands? He's been suffering from that severe rheumatoid arthritis for years. Can't even open a jar of jam without help, according to Mrs. Wellington." Blair sneered. "So? He's a chemist. He knows how to handle things." Hamish shook his head slowly. "The vial at the scene, sir. The one I saw. The cap was screwed on so tight that the plastic seal had bitten into the glass. I noticed it when I was looking at the Zen label. A man with Mr. Macbeth's hands couldn't have turned that cap, let alone gripped it tight enough to leave such a clean set of prints without smudging them through his tremors. And there's another thing, sir. The vial I saw, it had a tiny speck of blue wax on the base, like the wax they use for sealing expensive wine, or perhaps for sealing old-fashioned love letters in an attic. Blair's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. Wax, what are you blathering about, you Highland peasant? I have the weapon, and I have the man who owns the cabinet. That's evidence. You're just looking for excuses to protect your local friends. He slammed the door of the police car and signaled the driver to move. As the car sped away, splashing mud onto Hamish's boots, the village grew quiet. The crowd began to disperse, whispering about the murdering chemist, but Hamish remained standing in the rain. He knew MC Ivor was innocent. The fingerprints were too perfect, the motive too obvious, and the physical capability simply wasn't there. Someone had framed the chemist, using his own stock to hide a much more personal crime. Hamish looked up toward the MacGregor estate, hidden now by the darkening clouds. The pure zen wasn't the motive, it was the screen. The real reason for Julian Croft's death was buried deeper, linked to a blue wax seal and a secret that someone was willing to kill and frame a harmless old man keep. He whistled for lugs, his jaw set in a grim line. It was time to stop mooching and start setting a trap of his own. He needed to find that phone, and he needed to talk to a lady who lived in the past. The rain felt colder now, but the path was finally starting to clear. Shh! Hamish watched the tail lights of the police cruiser disappear into the curtains of rain, the red glow fading like embers in a cold hearth. The village cross felt hollow, the silence following Blair's departure heavier than the storm itself. He knew every stone of Lochdubh, and he knew that Arthur MC Ivor, a man who meticulously weighed out aspirin as if it were gold dust, would never have the stomach nor the steady hand to poison a man in such a theatrical fashion. It was too neat, too convenient for Blair, and far too clumsy for a real killer. The blue wax, however, was a persistent itch in Hamish's mind. It suggested a collision between the clinical world of the pharmacy and the dusty, decaying elegance of the Highland gentry. He climbed back into the Land Rover, the seat springs protesting with a familiar metallic groan, and turned the nose of the vehicle toward Ardnish. Lugs, sensing the shift in mood, rested his chin on the dashboard, his dark eyes watching the wiper's rhythmic dance. The road to Ardnish was a narrow, winding ribbon of tarmac that clung to the cliffs, frequently disappearing under shallow burns that had burst their banks. The house itself was a sprawling Victorian monstrosity of dark granite, surrounded by rhododendrons that looked like they were trying to reclaim the masonry. It was a place of high ceilings, drafty corridors, and a sense of permanent 1948. Lady Jane was in the morning room, which at this time of year was the only room small enough to keep warm. She was a bird-like woman, fragile in appearance, but possessing a spine of Scottish steel that had seen her through 2 wars and 3 recessions. She sat by a small, sputtering fire, a silver tea service on the table before her, looking exactly as a lady of the manor should look when a policeman calls unfazed and slightly bored. "It is about that man Croft, I assume, Macbeth," she said, her voice like dry parchment. "A dreadful business. To die in such a peculiar vessel, it lacks dignity." But then, Julian Croft was never a man of dignity. Hamish accepted the offered cup of tea, the fine bone china feeling dangerously light in his large, calloused hands. He was a man who collected things, Lady Jane. "Letters, I hear. Old letters with blue wax seals." Lady Jane did not flinch, but her hand paused for a fraction of a second over the sugar tongs. "He was a scavenger. Constable. He found a bundle of my correspondence in the MacGregor attic. Private thoughts from a very different time. He had the audacity to suggest they were historical artifacts that he might use to give his retreat a certain pedigree. It was blackmail, though he wrapped it in the velvet language of collaboration. "And did you give him what he wanted?" Hamish asked softly. "I gave him nothing but my contempt," she replied, her eyes flashing with a sudden cold fire. "But I was not the only one he was squeezing. He was a man who thrived on the small humiliations of others. He discovered that the young woman, Miss Miller, was not the graduate of the London College of Wellness she claimed to be. She was a runaway from a very troubled background in the East End, a girl with a record for petty theft. He used that to keep her in a state of near slavery. And then there was the matter of the local interest." Hamish leaned forward, the tea forgotten. Local interest. He wanted the land, Macbeth, just the MacGregor estate, but the grazing rights belonging to the smaller Crofts. He had discovered a technicality in the old deeds, something about access to the loch that had been ignored for a century. He was going to bankrupt half the village to build his exclusive jetty. He wasn't just a nuisance, he was a threat to our very way of life. He treated this glen like a board game. Hamish looked at the fire, the orange light dancing in his hazel eyes. The motive was becoming clearer, but it wasn't the grand, sweeping greed of a corporate raider. It was the petty, suffocating cruelty of a man who enjoyed pulling wings off flies. Croft had been poisoned with prussic acid, a substance that acted with terrifying speed. He had been in his sensory deprivation tanker place, where he felt invincible, floating in his expensive saltwater womb. The killer hadn't just wanted him dead, they had wanted him trapped in his own version of Zen when the end came. But who had the access? Who could walk into MC Ivor's pharmacy, steal the acid, and plant the evidence without being noticed? Who was invisible? The image of the hotel lobby flickered in Hamish's mind. He thought of the way Croft had kicked out at Lugs, the way he had dismissed Mr. Patel, and the way he had treated everyone as scenery. He remembered the small vial on the floor of the glass extension, the one with the blue wax. If Lady Jane hadn't killed him, then someone had used her letters, or at least the wax from them, to point the finger. It was a double blind. The killer was someone who knew about the letters, knew about MC Ivor's arthritis, and knew exactly when Croft would be in his tank. Thank you for the tea, Lady Jane, Hamish said, standing up. You've been most helpful. More helpful than you might realize. As he walked back to the Land Rover, the rain had turned to a fine, stinging sleet. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, the engine idling with a rhythmic thrum. The pieces were shifting. Croft hadn't been killed by a victim of his blackmail. He had been killed by someone who had been watching him from the shadows, someone who was tired of being treated like a piece of furniture, someone who had seen an opportunity to solve a dozen problems with one small vial of bitter almonds. Hamish looked at Lugs, who was shivering slightly. It's not about the money, Lugs, Hamish whispered. It's about being seen and being laughed at. Croft made the mistake of laughing at the wrong person. He shifted the gear stick into first. He knew now that the pure Zen elixir was a distraction, a bright, shiny lure to keep the police looking at London and synthetic drugs. The truth was much closer to home, rooted in the cold, hard soil of Lochdubh and the quiet rage of a person who had finally had enough. He needed to set a trap, and for that, he needed the one thing Croft had taken to his grave, his phone. If the phone wasn't in the pod, it was with the killer. And the killer was likely right under his nose, playing the part of the helpful bystander. Hamish felt a grim sense of satisfaction. The lazy constable was about to become very busy indeed. He drove back toward the village, his mind already weaving the threads of a plan that would trick the killer into one final, revealing mistake. The Highland darkness was deep, but Hamish Macbeth knew how to navigate the shadows. The sleet was turning the world into a monochrome blur as Hamish Macbeth steered the Land Rover back into the heart of Lochdubh. The village was tucked away under a heavy blanket of mist, the few street lamps casting long, watery shadows across the empty pavement. To any other policeman, the case would have seemed settled. Blair had his man, the evidence was locked in a cabinet, and the paperwork was likely already being mangled by a typewriter in Strathbane. But Hamish knew that the truth in the Highlands was rarely as loud as DC Thursday, Blair's shouting. It was a quiet thing, tucked away in the corners of rooms and the pauses between sentences. He pulled up outside the Lochdubh Arms, the local pub that served as both a sanctuary and a rumour mill. If he was going to set a trap, he needed the right bait, and there was no better place to go fishing for a killer than a room full of people who thought he was too stupid to catch a cold. Inside, the pub was thick with the scent of peat smoke, spilled ale, and the weary frustration of men who had been kept from their dinners by police cordons. Hamish walked in, shaking his cap, and letting Lugs weave through the legs of the patrons. He made a point of looking particularly dishevelled, his tie crooked, and his eyes wide with a sort of panicked bewilderment. He moved to the bar where Billy, the barman, was polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better decades. "A half pint of your weakest, Billy," Hamish sighed, loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear, "and perhaps a packet of those salt and vinegar crisps. I have a long night ahead of me, and Blair has left me with a mess that would baffle the great Sherlock himself." A few of the locals looked up, their interest piqued by the mention of the DCI. "I thought Blair arrested the chemist, Hamish." Geordie MC Norton asked from his usual corner, said it was an open and shut case of professional jealousy. Hamish leaned heavily against the bar, looking as though the weight of the world was pressing down on his red hair. "Aye, that's what he thinks. But between you and me, Geordie, the man has the brains of a turnip. He's gone back to Strathbane to celebrate, but he's forgotten the most important thing. He forgot about the cloud." A confused silence fell over the pub. "The cloud?" Billy asked, pausing his polishing. "Is that some new weather pattern coming over the Minch?" Hamish shook his head with a sage, mournful expression. "No, Billy, it's the digital cloud. You see, Mr. Croft had one of those fancy phones that records everything, every heartbeat, every step, every word spoken in that glass room, and sends it straight to a computer in London. Blair thinks the phone is missing. But what he doesn't know is that the computer in London has already sent a copy of the last hour of Mr. Croft's life back to the station here. It's sitting on my desk right now, but the encryption is so thick I can't get it open without a special decoder key that's arriving on the morning post from the Inverness Special Branch. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his ale, watching the room over the rim of the glass. Once that key arrives at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I'll be able to see exactly who was in that room when the Zen elixir was swapped for the poison. It'll be as clear as a BBC broadcast. He noticed a subtle shift in the room. In the far corner, near the dartboard, a figure sat in the shadows, their face obscured by a newspaper. The paper didn't move, but the person's knuckles were white against the newsprint. Hamish continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. But the trouble is, I have to leave the station unattended for a bit. Do I have to go down to the jetty at the MacGregor estate tonight? Forensic experts say the source of the blue wax might still be there, caught in the weed beds where the killer tried to weigh it down. It's a delicate job, and I'll be there from midnight until 2, trying to fish it out with a net. If only I had that decoder key tonight, I wouldn't have to freeze my bones off in the loch. He finished his ale, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and whistled for lugs. Right then. I'd best get to the station and make sure no one tries to break in for that encrypted file. Not that anyone in Lochdubh would know a computer from a toaster, eh? He let out a forced, braying laugh that made several people wince, then lumbered out of the pub, looking every bit the bumbling village constable. Once outside, however, the mask slipped, his gait straightened, and his eyes became sharp and predatory. He didn't go to the station. Instead, he drove the Land Rover to a hidden copse of trees overlooking the old stone jetty of the MacGregor estate. He knew the killer wouldn't go for the station. The risk of a digital file was too abstract. But the physical evidence, the source of the blue wax, and the missing phone, that was a tangible threat that had to be destroyed. Hamish sat in the darkness, the engine off, the only sound the rhythmic patter of sleet on the roof. He had planted 2 seeds, the fear of the digital recording and the location of the physical evidence. He had mentioned the jetty because it was the one place where a person could accidentally fall into the deep, freezing waters of the loch if they weren't careful. It was also the place where Julian Croft had planned to build his jetty, the very project that had threatened the livelihoods of everyone in the glen. As the hours ticked by, Lugs began to snore softly in the passenger seat, but Hamish remained motionless, a part of the Highland night. At exactly 12:15, a pair of headlights appeared on the track, moving slowly and without lights. A car coasted to a halt near the water's edge. A figure stepped out, shrouded in a heavy waterproof coat, carrying a long-handled rake and a flashlight. The figure moved toward the end of the jetty, the beam of the light dancing over the black, churning water. Hamish watched as they began to frantically scrape at the weed beds, their movements hurried and desperate. They weren't looking for a phone, they were looking to make sure nothing was there to be found. But more importantly, they were carrying a small, heavy bag that they clearly intended to drop into the DPS, a bag that likely contained the real pure Zen vials and the missing phone. Hamish stepped out of the Land Rover, the door clicking shut with a sound like a pistol shot in the silence. He didn't turn on his torch. He didn't shout. He simply walked toward the jetty, his boots silent on the wet grass. "It's a cold night for gardening, isn't it?" he said, his voice mild and conversational. The figure on the jetty spun around, the flashlight beam swinging wildly until it caught Hamish's face. The killer gasped, the bag slipping from their fingers and landing with a dull thud on the wooden planks. The trap was sprung, and as the light hit the killer's face, Hamish felt a pang of disappointment. It wasn't who he had expected, but it was exactly who the logic of the invisible demanded. The flashlight beam trembled in Mr. Patel's grip, the circle of light skittering across the wet timber of the jetty like a panicked moth. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the rhythmic slap of the loch against the pilings and the heavy, ragged breathing of a man who had finally run out of places to hide. Mr. Patel, usually the epitome of composed, hospitality-driven patience, looked suddenly ancient. His face was a mask of grey shadows, his eyes wide and glinting with a frantic, animal light. He looked at the heavy bag at his feet, then back at Hamish, who stood as still as a mountain crag, his hands deep in his pockets, and his expression one of profound, quiet disappointment. "I was truly hoping I was wrong, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, his Highland voice carrying clearly over the wind, devoid of its usual deceptive lilt. "I was hoping that when I stood here in the dark, I would see a stranger. But the Highlands have a way of keeping the trouble close to the hearth. You've been at the hotel a long time. You've seen everything, heard everything, and you've become as invisible as the wallpaper. Julian Croft made the mistake of thinking that because you served him, you didn't exist. He treated you like a piece of furniture, and that was his final, fatal error. Patel's voice, when it finally came, was a dry, rasping whisper. He was going to destroy it all, Hamish. You don't know. You just sit in your station and drink your coffee. He didn't just want to build a retreat. He had the deeds, the old MacGregor papers. He was going to claim the foreshore rights. The hotel would have lost its access to the loch. My family, we have poured everything into that building. 3 generations of work, and he was going to turn it into a private playground for bankers who want to pretend they are spiritual. He laughed at me when I asked him to reconsider. He laughed and told me to bring him his matcha latte and to make sure the towels were fluffy. So you decided to give him a different kind of pure zen, Hamish said, stepping a fraction closer. You knew his routine. You knew he spent every evening in that tank, cut off from the world. It was the perfect place for a murder. No one would hear a struggle, not that there was one. You just swapped the vials. You knew he was going to be too relaxed, too mindful to notice the scent of bitter almonds until it was too late, and you used the blue wax from Lady Jane's letters you'd seen in his room. When you were checking the mini Bartow, make sure that if the police did look closer, they would look at the gentry. Patel's grip on the rake tightened. It was justice. The man was a parasite. He was poisoning the village with his fake powders and his greed. Why should he be allowed to live while good men like Archie and Mr. Mency Ivor are crushed by people like him? And Mency Ivor, I didn't want him arrested, Hamish. I thought Blair would see it as a suicide. I thought the pure Zen label would be enough. But Blair he is a man of limited imagination. Blair is a fool, Hamish agreed, his eyes never leaving Patel's hands. But he's a fool with handcuffs. And you made one mistake, Mr. Patel. You assumed I was as blind as Croft was. You assumed that because I'm lazy Macbeth, I wouldn't notice that the vial at the scene had been handled with a cloth. Yet it had fingerprints planted on it, perfect, trembling fingerprints that could only have been pressed there after the fact. You took MC Ivor's glass from the pub, didn't you? The one he always uses for his tonic water. You pressed it against the vial. It was too perfect. Real crimes are messy, Mr. Patel. They don't look like a chemistry experiment. Patel let out a sharp, hysterical laugh. And the phone? You lied about the cloud, didn't you? There is no encrypted file. There is no cloud, Hamish said softly. But there is a phone. It's in that bag, isn't it? Along with the rest of the prussic acid you stole from the pharmacy's backup stock. You knew where the key was kept because you've delivered supplies there for years. You are the invisible man of Lochdubh, Mr. Patel. But even invisible men leave footprints in the mud. Suddenly, the air seemed to crack. Patel didn't surrender. The desperation that had been building inside him for days finally broke its banks. With a strangled cry, he lunged, not away from Hamish, but toward the edge of the jetty, intending to throw the bag into the deepest part of the loch. Hamish moved with a speed that would have shocked DC Vi. Blair suddenly, fluid grace born of years of navigating treacherous hillsides. He caught Patel's arm, but the hotel manager was fueled by a wiry, frantic strength. They grappled on the slick timber, the loch churning hungrily below them. Patel swung the heavy metal rake, the tines whistling past Hamish's ear. You should have stayed in your chair, Macbeth. You should have let it go. Hamish didn't use his baton. He didn't need to. He used the man's own momentum, stepping aside and catching Patel's wrist in a grip of iron. At the same moment, Lugs, who had been watching with bristling hackles, darted forward and sank his teeth into the hem of Patel's heavy coat. The distraction was enough. Hamish twisted the arm back, forcing the rake to clatter onto the wood, and pinned Patel against the railing. The struggle was brief, messy, and silent, save for the heavy breathing of the two men. It's over, Arthur, Hamish panted, the rain matting his red hair to his forehead. There's been enough death in this glen. Don't add your own to the tally. Patel slumped, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had come. He began to weep, the sound of a man who had tried to save his world and succeeded only in destroying himself. Hamish reached into his pocket and produced the handcuffs, the cold steel clicking shut with a finality that seemed to echo across the water. He picked up the bag, feeling the weight of the phone and the glass vials within. It was all the evidence Blair would need to change his mind, though Hamish already knew how he would have to frame the discovery to keep his own peace. He stood there for a long moment, holding the sobbing man as the sleet turned to snow. the white flakes disappearing into the black loch. The wellness king was dead, the invisible man was caught, and Lochdubh was still standing, though it felt a little colder than it had yesterday. Hamish looked out at the dark mountains, feeling the familiar, hollow ache of a case solved, but a life ruined. He had the killer, but he felt no triumph. He only felt the need for a very long sleep and a very hot pot of tea. But first, he had to deal with Blair, and that would require the greatest performance of his life. The snow was beginning to settle on the frozen heather as Hamish led a silent, staggering Mr. Patel back toward the Land Rover. The man's earlier fire had been extinguished by the cold reality of the handcuffs, leaving behind only the hollow shell of a hotelier who had cared too much for his heritage. Lugs trotted ahead, his tail a low, rhythmic wag of victory, though Hamish felt only a heavy, sinking fatigue. She helped Patel into the passenger seat, the metal of the cuffs clicking against the plastic door molding with a clinical final sound. As they drove back through the winding, treacherous tracks toward the Lochdubh police station, Hamish didn't speak. He was already rehearsing the performance he would have to give. To tell the truth that he, the lowly PC Macbeth, had deduced the motive, set the trap, and apprehended the killer would be his professional suicide. DC-wise Blair would be so impressed he'd have Hamish promoted to sergeant and shipped off to a bleak, concrete precinct in Glasgow before the paperwork was dry. He could see it now, the grey sirens, the urban grime, and the lack of a decent lock for miles. He wanted none of it. The police station was a small, whitewashed building that felt more like a cozy cottage than a seat of law. Hamish led Patel inside, sat him on a hard wooden chair by the cooling peat fire, and put the fresh kettle on the stove. He needed the warmth, but more importantly, he needed the pause. He dialed the number for the Strathbane headquarters, and when the sleepy-voiced sergeant answered, Hamish asked for DC Fastvai Blair. It took 10 long minutes for Blair to get to the phone, and his voice was a sandpaper rasp of pure irritation. Macbeth? If this isn't a fire or a riot, I'll have your badge for breakfast. Do you have any idea what time it is? I'm so sorry to bother you, sir, Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, syrupy Highland lilt, the kind that made him sound as though he were reading from a primary school primer. But you see, I was just thinking about that brilliant point you made earlier, about how the local knowledge was the key and how the jetty was the heart of the dispute. I was just wandering about down there, following the Blair instinct as I call it, and I bumped into Mr. Patel. He was carrying a bag, sir. A bag with a phone and some bottles in it. I think he was trying to hide the evidence you so cleverly predicted would be there. I was just lucky enough to be standing where you suggested I look. It was a masterstroke of yours, sir. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Hamish could almost hear the gears of Blair's vanity grinding together, desperately trying to find a way to claim the discovery. Is that so? Blair finally said, his tone shifting from rage to a cautious, oily curiosity. You say you were following my lead about the jetty, the one I mentioned in passing while we were processing the scene earlier. Oh, absolutely, sir. I would never have thought of it myself. I'm just a simple village officer, after all. I was just the boots on the ground, so to speak. But it was your focus on the land rights and the hotel's interests that pointed the way. Mr. Patel here is quite ready to tell you everything. He's very impressed with how quickly you saw through his little scheme. He's quite broken, really. He just wants to talk to a proper detective like yourself. Right. Don't move, Blair barked, the sound of a man scenting a promotion. I'll be there in 40 minutes, and Macbeth, don't touch that bag. It's a delicate crime scene. My crime scene. I want everything exactly as I imagined it would be when I gave you those orders. Do not breathe on it. By the time the dark sedan screeched into the Lochdubh station's small lot, Hamish had managed to look significantly more confused and disheveled than usual. She had ruffled his hair, spilled a bit of cold tea on his tunic, and was sitting with a blank expression, staring at a moth on the ceiling. Blair burst in, followed by a weary Anderson and Mac Nab. The DCI's eyes went straight to the bag on the desk, and then to the broken man in the chair. Well, Blair sneered, his chest puffing out like a prize pigeon in a park. Patel! I knew the hotel was the center of it. I told you, didn't I, Anderson? I said the invisible ones are always the ones to watch. Macbeth here just stumbled upon him while I was directing the search from the rear. Good lad, Macbeth. For once you didn't trip over your own laces while executing my strategy. I'll make sure the report reflects my tactical oversight and your prompt obedience. Hamish nodded eagerly, looking like a grateful golden retriever. It was all you, sir. I was just standing there, and there he was. I nearly let him go, thinking he was just out for a midnight stroll, but then I remembered what you said about being thorough and skeptical. I'm just glad I didn't ruin your investigation. I'd hate to think I let a killer escape after you'd already done the hard work of identifying him. It would have been a terrible shame. Blair walked over to Patel, looming over him with a smug, predatory grin. Thought you could outsmart me, didn't you? Thought the big city copper wouldn't understand the village politics. I saw through you the moment I stepped into that hotel lobby. The way you looked at Croft one noted it down. Subject exhibits suppressed hostility, I wrote in my mental notes. Didn't I, MacNab? MacNab merely nodded with a glazed expression. You're a genius, sir, Hamish chimed in. I suppose this will be a big feather in your cap back at the yard. Pay commendation, at the very least. You'll be a superintendent before we know it. I'll be proud to say I worked under you. Blair's eyes gleamed with ambition. He could already see the headlines. Yes, well, it's all in a day's work. Anderson, get him in the car. MacNab, take the evidence. Securely. I don't want Macbeth's fingerprints all over my promotion. He's already contaminated the air in here enough with that cheap tea. As they led Patel out, the hotel manager looked back at Hamish. For a second, his eyes cleared, and he saw the lazy constable for exactly what he was. He saw the sharp intelligence and the kindness. He realized that Hamish wasn't just letting Blair take the credit to avoid work. He was doing it to keep the village from being poked and prodded by any more ambitious outsiders. If Blair was the hero, the case was closed, and everyone would leave Lochdubh alone. Patel gave a single, microscopic nod of understanding before being pushed into the car. Blair stood at the door, tapping his baton. I'll write the report, Macbeth. You just stay here and go count some sheep. Try not to hurt yourself. I'll make sure the chief constable knows you were present and helpful. Thank you, sir, Hamish said, saluting with just enough clumsiness to be convincing. I'll just stay here and have another cup of tea then. No sense in me getting in the way. He watched the taillights disappear. The station was quiet again, the threat of promotion gone. Hamish walked to the window and looked out at the sleeping village. Tomorrow, the gossip would start, and he would have to listen to everyone tell him how lucky he was that Deceivas Blair had been there. He would smile, he would nod, and he would pretend to be the luckiest, laziest policeman in Scotland. She turned off the lights and whistled for lugs. It was time to go home to his own fire, his dog, and a piece that was worth more than any medal Blair could imagine. The Highlands were safe, and that was more than enough for Hamish Macbeth. He sighed softly, content. He walked toward the door, ready to leave. The morning broke over the peaks of Sutherland, with a clarity that felt like a personal apology for the week's miserable weather. The air was crisp, tasting of ozone and pine, and the loch was a sheet of polished obsidian, undisturbed by the wind that had spent the last 3 days trying to scour the village. Hamish moved slowly. The stove was at a perfect, low glow, and the aroma of frying bacon was beginning to challenge the stale scent of damp wool that usually permeated the kitchen. Lugs was stationed by the hearth, his tail thumping a soft, contented rhythm against the floorboards. The arrest of Arthur Patel had sent a ripple through the community, but like a stone thrown into the deep waters of the loch, the surface was already beginning to smooth over. He had already received 3 phone calls before 8 o'clock. The first was from Mrs. Wellington at the post office, who was simultaneously horrified that a respectable man like Patel could be a murderer, and delighted that she had been the first to suspect his nature. Hamish had listened with a sympathetic eye, letting her believe that her observations had been the catalyst for DC the Fire's deduction. The second call was from the editor of the local paper, looking for a quote. Hamish had directed him straight to Strathbane, ensuring that Blair's name would be the only one in the headlines. Charles was a brief, grunted acknowledgement from a junior officer that the paperwork was being handled and that Hamish was expected to stay in Lochdubh to mind the shop. After breakfast, Hamish took a stroll down to the village cross. The atmosphere was one of excitement. Outside the Tommel Castle Hotel, the electric blue Aston Martin of the late Julian Croft was being loaded onto a flatbed trailer. Its pristine paintwork was now dulled by a layer of Highland salt. Miss Miller stood by the entrance, her suitcases at her feet. She looked older than she had 2 days ago, but the paralyzing fear had left her eyes. She was headed back to London, free from the zen shadow of a man who had viewed her as an asset. Hamish watched her go, hoping she found a place where she didn't have to smell like lavender to feel safe. He walked toward Ardnish. Lady Jane was in her conservatory, surrounded by dying ferns. On the table between them lay a small, scorched bundle of letters. Hamish had found them in the bag Patel had tried to dump. Blair had been so obsessed with the vials of poison that he had dismissed the old paper as rubbish. I believe these belong in your family archives, Lady Jane. Hamish said softly. DC-Fi's Blair felt they had no bearing on the criminal proceedings. He's a man who only sees what's written in black and white, not the history between the lines. Lady Jane's thin fingers touched the top letter, the blue wax seal long since broken. You are a good man, Macbeth. A quiet, dangerous good man. I shall remember this when the police committee discusses the budget. As he made his way back, a silver Volvo slowed to a crawl. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe leaned out, her blonde hair catching the winter sun. Father is very pleased, Hamish. She's already telling the neighbours how lucky the Glen is to have a man like Detective Chief Inspector Blair to protect us from criminals. There was a teasing glint in her eyes. And what about you, Hamish? Are you pleased to be a lucky bystander once again? Hamish leaned against the car door, enjoying the warmth. I'm just happy the post is moving again, Priscilla, and that I won't have to learn the bus routes of Glasgow. It's a very complicated city. Priscilla laughed, a clear, bright sound. Elspeth left a message. She said she's found a lead on a story in Edinburgh. She said to tell you that your secret is safe, mostly because no one would believe the truth, even if she wrote it. The car pulled away. He looked at the mountains, the peaks of Suilven, and the eternal blue of the Loch. He belonged here, among the secrets and the rain and the people who knew who he was. He spent the afternoon in a state of sloth. He visited Mr. Memsey Ivor, who had been released from custody with an apology. The chemist was back behind his counter, his hands still trembling. They shared a quiet dram of whiskey, a toast to the fact that truth often took a roundabout way of coming home. As the sun dipped, Hamish took his fishing rod and headed for the quietest stretch of the river. He stood in the shallows, the cold water numbing his legs, and cast his line with effortless precision. He didn't think about the pure zen or the bitter smell of almonds. He thought about the stew he was going to make for dinner and the history book he had been meaning to finish. He caught a trout, just enough for himself and lugs, and walked back toward the station. The fish was a beauty, its scales shimmering like moonlight in a net, a testament to the life that thrived beneath the cold surface. He carried his prize with quiet achievement. The lights of the village twinkled against the dark. He reached his front door, the wood feeling solid and welcoming. The case was over. The outsider was gone, the village was peace, and Hamish was home. He stepped inside, closed the door against the chill, and let the quiet of the Highlands settle around him like a coat. It was a good life, he thought, as long as one knew when to listen to the silence and when to speak to the ghosts. He looked at the embers of the fire, thinking of how easily a man can lose way when he forgets the value of simple things. It was a lesson the Glen taught every day. Lugs curled up by the fire, let out a satisfied sigh, and the day was done. The following evening, the sun dipped behind the jagged silhouette of the store, painting the sky in bruised purples and defiant oranges. In Lochdubh, the transition from day to night was rarely a gentle affair. It was a surrender to the ancient darkness that had owned these glens long before the first stone of the village was laid. PC Hamish Macbeth stood on the pier, the salt spray cooling his face, watching the last of the forensic vans rattle away toward the main road. The wellness revolution of Julian Croft had lasted exactly 3 weeks, and its primary legacy was a series of police statements and a glass extension that now looked like a very expensive greenhouse, waiting for a winter that would surely shatter it. The village was settling into that peculiar, heavy silence that follows a great scandal. It was the sound of people retreating to their hearths to dissect the tragedy over tea and something stronger. Treya, that afternoon, the Strathbane Sentinel, had arrived at the post office with a front-page headline that had made Hamish's morning. Blair strikes again. DC Vars cracks Highland poison plot. Below it was a photograph of Detective Chief Inspector Blair, looking remarkably like a toad that had just swallowed a particularly succulent fly. The article detailed Blair's tireless surveillance and expert psychological profiling that had led him to suspect the hotelier from the very beginning. Hamish had pinned the clipping to the station's notice board, right next to a poster about a missing goat from 3 years ago. It was his insurance policy. As long as that photograph was the public face of the investigation, Hamish was safe. A grand man, that Blair, Archie the milkman had remarked, leaning against his float as he read the paper over Hamish's shoulder. Though I don't remember him being at the jetty at midnight. I must have been blinkered by the excitement. He has a very discreet way of working. Archie, Hamish had replied, his face a mask of solemn innocence. High-level tactics. We wouldn't understand the half of it. It's why he's in Strathbane, and I'm here, scraping the mud off my boots. Archie had grunted, satisfied, and moved on to deliver the semi-skim to the hotel, which was now being managed by a bewildered cousin of Mr. Patel's from Glasgow. The cycle of the village was moving again, and while there was a sadness for Patel, who had been a fixture of the community, there was a greater, more fundamental relief that the outsider's disruption had been purged. The Highlands did not like to be poked. They preferred to be left to their own brooding devices. Hamish turned away from the water and began the slow climb back to the police station, trotted beside him, occasionally stopping to investigate a particularly interesting scent in the gutter. As he walked, Hamish noticed that the retreat sign at the end of the MacGregor track had been knocked over. Whether it was the wind or a well-placed boot from a passing crofter, he didn't know, and he certainly didn't intend to investigate. Some things were better left to the elements. Inside the station, the air was cold but smelled of home. Hamish moved with the practiced economy of a man who lived alone and liked it. He built up the fire in the kitchen grate, the peat catching with a welcoming hiss and a sweet, earthy smoke. This was the moment he lived for. The aftermath of the storm, the quiet that followed the noise of other people's lives. He set a heavy iron pot on the stove. Inside was the remains of a mutton stew he had started that morning, thick, brown, and smelling of onions, carrots, and a generous splash of Guinness. It wasn't pure Zen, and it certainly wasn't gluten-free, but as the steam began to rise, Hamish felt a sense of peace that no sensory deprivation tank could ever provide. He sat at the table, a chipped mug of strong black coffee in his hands, and opened a letter that had arrived in the evening post. It wasn't from a lawyer or a superior. It was a simple, elegant envelope with no return address. Inside was a single, small photograph of the Ardenish hills in autumn and a short note. The archives are restored. The past is back where it belongs. Thank you, Constable. Hamish smiled, then carefully fed the note into the fire. Secrets were the only currency that really mattered in the Highlands, and he was a very rich man in that regard. The telephone on the desk in the front office let out a sudden, sharp ring. Hamish froze, his spoon halfway to the stew pot. He looked at the door, then at the clock. It was nearly 7. DCI Blair might be calling to gloat further, or perhaps Mrs. Wellington had seen a strange light on the loch. He waited. The phone rang 3 times, 4, 5. Then, with a click of the answering machine he'd finally been forced to install, the silence returned. "I'm out on patrol," the machine's recorded voice, Hamish's own, sounding particularly dim-witted, informed the caller. "Please leave a message after the tone, and I'll get back to you as soon as the weather permits." Hamish took a bite of the stew. It was perfect. The mutton was tender, and the gravy had the kind of depth that only comes from slow, patient waiting. He looked down at Lugs, who was staring up at him with expectant brown eyes. Hamish dropped a small piece of meat into the dog's mouth. "They think we're stupid, Lugs," Hamish whispered, the firelight dancing in his hazel eyes. "They think we're just part of the scenery, like the heather or the rocks, and that's exactly how we'll keep it." He leaned back in his chair, the warmth of the kitchen wrapping around him like a familiar blanket. Tomorrow, there would be petty squabbles about fences, and perhaps a tourist would get their car stuck in a ditch, and Blair would undoubtedly call to shout about some missing paperwork. But tonight, the loch was quiet, the killer was in a cell, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he wanted to be. He was the king of his own small, rainy castle, and as far as the rest of the world was concerned, he was doing absolutely nothing at all. He took another sip of his coffee, let out a long, contented sigh, and watched the embers of the fire glow red in the gathering Highland night. The peace of Lochdubh had been restored, and for Hamish, that was the only promotion he would ever need.